Hi, this is Matt Baker. Last month, I started a new series called Who Was Jesus Really? In episode 1, we explored the possibility that Jesus was a grandson of Herod the Great, as well as a descendant of the Hasmoneans. Well, in today's video, we're going to explore a different hypothesis, one in which Jesus was actually the leader of a major insurrection, and the exact same person that Josephus refers to as the Egyptian. But first, let me clear something up. The goal of this series is not to debate whether or not Jesus was or is divine. My assumption is that you've already made up your mind about that issue, one way or the other. My goal is simply to explore some fun ideas about who Jesus might have been as a historical person, for those of us who have already come to the conclusion that he was a mere man. However, this doesn't mean that there's nothing of value in this series for committed Christians. Along the way, I'll be presenting a lot of real-world information about the time period in which Jesus lived. So, as long as you don't mind hearing alternative viewpoints, go ahead and keep watching. In episode 1, we mostly focused on the Herodian and Hasmonean family trees. Well, in episode 2, we'll be focusing more on the general timeline of events. This is because if Jesus was the guy that Josephus calls the Egyptian, it's going to require a shift in time, which happens to be the name of the book that this episode is based on. A Shift in Time was written by Lena Einhorn, who is a medical doctor and film director from Sweden. Personally, I find her hypothesis to be more compelling than the one we discussed last time. But again, this series is not about arguing for one particular view over others. It's simply about presenting a bunch of different viewpoints. Which is why I once again asked Ground News to sponsor this video. You see, Ground News is a website and app that allows you to examine thousands of news topics from a variety of different angles. For every breaking story, they combine coverage from multiple sources so that you can compare reporting from across the political spectrum and the world. For example, they recently gathered over 80 articles about Cynthia Erivo being cast to play Jesus in the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. By the way, you can follow along at home by scanning the QR code on screen, or by clicking the link in the description below. Sources on the left focused on how this will be her first role since the movie Wicked, whereas sources on the right focused on the fact that she is female, black, and queer. So obviously, depending on what source you read, you can end up having a totally different perspective, which is why Ground News is so, useful. They even have useful charts. I love how their app uses charts, like these ones, to show additional data on each news source, such as whether they lean to one side politically and even where they get their funding from. It even highlights what isn't being widely covered on the blind spot feed. Thus, it can help you have more productive conversations with family and friends on contentious topics. So, in a world that is constantly changing, Ground News is a tool that we all need. You can check it out now by going to ground.news/charts or by using the link in the description or pinned comment. Subscribe through my channel this month and you will save 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. So let's take a look at the timeline of Judean history around the time of Jesus. First, let's place the local rulers on the chart. As we discussed last time, Herod the Great ruled Judea from 37 BCE to his death in 4 BCE, at which time he was succeeded in Judea by his son Herod Archelaus. Archelaus then reigned until 6 CE, which is when the Romans, who were the real rulers, decided to make Judea an official province and replace the Jewish monarchy with Roman governors. The first 7 governors were Coponius, Ambivulus, Rufus, Gratus, Pontius Pilate, Marcellus, and Marillus. Of these 7 names, it's likely that only one stands out to you. That would be Pontius Pilate, because according to the New Testament and several other sources, he was the governor when Jesus was killed. We'll come back to that event in a moment, but for now, let's continue on with the rulers. In 41 CE, the monarchy in Judea was briefly reinstated, with Herod Agrippa, a grandson of Herod the Great, being made king. But his reign did not last long, because in 44 CE, he suddenly dropped dead, probably from being poisoned, an event that the Bible actually records in Acts 21, verses 21 to 23. After Agrippa, it was back to governors, the most notable being Felix, who ruled the longest and is mentioned several times in the Bible in connection to Paul's arrest and trial. Now, in addition to the local rulers, let me also add the Roman emperors to the chart. The first, of course, was Augustus, who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. He reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, and was then followed by Tiberius from 14 to 37, Caligula from 37 to 41, Claudius from 41 to 54, and Nero from 54 to 68. With Nero's death, the dynasty that had started with Julius Caesar came to an end, and civil war broke out, resulting in 69 CE being the year of 4 emperors. In the end, a general named Vespasian was victorious, and he was able to establish a new dynasty, known as the Flavians. Next, let's add Jesus to the timeline. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was born sometime around Herod the Great's death in 4 BCE. However, according to the Gospel of Luke, he was born at the time of a census associated with a Syrian governor named Quirinius. We know that that census took place in 6 CE because that was the year that the Romans deposed Herod Archelaus. Basically, before appointing Coponius, they sent in Quirinius from the next-door province of Syria to calculate how much tax they could get from their new province of Judea. This is really important because it sparked a major Jewish rebellion led by a man known as Judas of Galilee. We'll be talking more about him in episode 3, but for now, just take note that Luke associates the birth of Jesus with the rebellion of 6 CE. Now, one of the most helpful bits of chronological information given in the entire New Testament can be found in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. It starts off with, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This is very helpful because we know that Tiberius's 15th year was 28 CE. Luke then goes on to talk about John the Baptist starting his ministry in that year, and then Jesus starting his soon thereafter. We thus have an earliest possible start date for Jesus becoming a public figure. As for when Jesus died, most scholars place that event in either 30 or 33 CE. So, according to the Bible, this window here of 5 years represents when all the main events in Jesus' life took place. Okay, there's one last thing I want to put on this timeline: unrest, meaning times when Jewish rebel activity was high. I've already mentioned the rebellion of 6 CE. That was actually the culmination of many years of unrest that had been building ever since the Herodians took over. But the rebellion of 6 CE was quashed by the Romans so successfully that things went quiet for the next several decades. In fact, in describing Judea during those decades, the famous Roman historian Tacitus said, "Under Tiberius, all was quiet." But then, starting with the death of Agrippa, which was during the reign of Claudius, things got noisy once again. In fact, from this point onwards, the unrest kept building and eventually resulted in the First Jewish-Roman War, which began in 66 and culminated in the complete destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the year 70. And guess who was the Roman general in charge of Roman troops during that war? None other than Vespasian, who ended up becoming the emperor. Okay, now that I've set the scene, let me introduce you to the main argument from Lena Einhorn's book, A Shift in Time. Basically, Einhorn argues that Jesus could not have been active from 28 to 33 CE because the Gospels are full of references to rebel activity, even though we know that there were no rebels active in Judea during the reign of Tiberius. Let me give you some specifics. First, there's the crucifixion itself. As you might know, images of the crucifixion usually contain not 1, but 3 crosses. That's because, according to the Gospels, Jesus was hung between 2 thieves, or robbers. The Greek word for thief here is lestai, which could be more accurately translated as a rebel or revolutionary. You see, Alestai was not just a simple thief, but rather a thief who stole in order to support a rebellion. Then there's Barabbas, the guy who Pilate released instead of Jesus. According to Mark 15, verse 7, Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the insurrection. What insurrection? This was supposedly 30 or 33 CE, and there hadn't been any insurrections in Jerusalem since 6 CE. Einhorn went as far as to count every reference to the word robber or rebel in Josephus and made this chart from her findings. As you can see, Josephus uses the word rebel many times before 6 CE and many times after 44 CE, but 0 times, that's right, 0 times between 6 and 44. But wait, there's more. In John 18, verse 12, Jesus is arrested on the Mount of Olives. It says the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. The Greek word for soldiers there is spira, which refers to a unit with at least 600 soldiers. And the Greek word for officer is kiliarchos, which literally means commander of 1,000. So even though Jesus supposedly had only 11 disciples with him at that point, the leaders sent 600 to 1,000 soldiers to capture him. This might be an indication that in the real version of events, Jesus might have been on the Mount of Olives with a much larger group of followers. And he might not have been just waiting around and praying. Maybe in the real version, he was planning an attack on the city of Jerusalem, which was then thwarted by the Romans. Now, lest you think that's crazy, let me show you some more hints from the Bible itself that point towards insurrection. In Luke 22, verse 36, as they are about to go to the Mount of Olives, Jesus tells his disciples to get ready. He says, "The one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag. And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one." So here's Jesus literally telling people to bring swords. And we know that they did because later Peter uses a sword to cut off someone's ear. Even the names of the disciples point to rebellion. For example, Peter is also known as Simon Bar-Jonah. Bar-Jonah is usually interpreted as being 2 words, Bar-Jonah, meaning son of Jonah. But as a single word, which it is, Bar-Jonah actually means rebel or insurrectionist. Then there's James and John, called the sons of thunder. The Greek word for thunder there is most commonly used to refer to rebellion. So really, it's James and John, the sons of rebellion. There's also Simon the Zealot. The Zealots definitely being a major Jewish rebel group. And Judas Iscariot. Iscariot meaning one who carries a dagger. Einhorn gives many more examples in her book of how the details in the New Testament point to a more rebellious time period. For now, I want to jump to her solution. While the characters and events in the Gospels do not fit with what we know about the 20s and 30s CE, they fit perfectly with what we know of the 40s and 50s. In other words, if we just shift everything by about 20 years, it all makes sense, especially the part about the story coming to a climax on the Mount of Olives. Which brings me to the individual that Josephus calls the Egyptian. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 8, Josephus tells us about the death of Emperor Claudius and the start of the reign of Nero. So that puts us around the year 54 or 55 CE. He then writes, "Moreover, there came out of Egypt, about this time, to Jerusalem, one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city and at a distance of 5 furlongs. He said farther that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls, when they were fallen down. Now, when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight, but did not appear anymore. Now, here's the really interesting thing. This guy, who we simply know as the Egyptian, also shows up, albeit very briefly, in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 21, Paul, arguably the most important leader of the early Christian movement, gets arrested in Jerusalem. In verse 38, we read that the first thing that the Roman official says to him is, "Aren't you one of the followers of Jesus, the man we crucified 2 decades ago?" Actually, no, that's not what it says. What he says is, "Are you not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" In other words, the official confuses Paul with the figure called the Egyptian and assumes that Paul must be involved in that movement. Now, I want you to notice 4 elements in this verse: Egypt, the number 4,000, assassins, and the wilderness. First off, the word assassin. The Greek word here is Sicarii, which was a type of Jewish rebel, perhaps a subset of the zealots, who carried a small sword or dagger under their cloak. Very reminiscent of the disciples on the Mount of Olives. Second, there's the mention of the wilderness. We know for certain that Jesus spent a lot of time in the wilderness, and this was often where he would teach and draw crowds. Third, the number 4,000 is interesting because it also shows up in connection to Jesus, being the number of people he fed with 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. Finally, there's Egypt. That's the one piece that doesn't fit, right? After all, Jesus was from Galilee, not Egypt, so why would anyone refer to him as the Egyptian? Well, remember, the Gospel of Matthew says that after Jesus was born, his family fled to Egypt. We also have very little information about the first 30 years of his life, so maybe the family actually stayed in Egypt longer than is thought. After all, there was a large Jewish community there. Another possible source for the Egyptian/Jesus is the Talmud. It has long been speculated that a figure mentioned there by the name of Ben Stada might actually be a reference to Jesus. In Shabbat 104b, verse 5, it says, "Didn't the infamous Ben Stada take magic spells out of Egypt in a scratch on his flesh?" It then goes on to explain how stada means to stray, and that this is a reference to his mother Mary, who had him out of wedlock with a man named Pantera. So, if this is indeed a reference to Jesus, it's evidence that people may have thought that his miracles were based on things he had learned in Egypt. Now, none of these points are knockdown arguments that prove that Jesus and the Egyptian were one and the same. But there are enough similarities that when taken together with the time shift, make it at least a possibility worth considering. Here's how it would work. Let's say that Jesus was born in Judea, but then taken to Egypt by his parents, where he grew up and eventually learned to do some magic. Now, whether this was just illusion designed to trick people, or whether he actually believed he was using some sort of ancient Egyptian knowledge, doesn't really matter. Because either way, sometime in the 50s CE, he ended up back in Judea, where he then used this magic to perform miracles and draw crowds. He also gave his opinions about religion and philosophy, and eventually felt that he had a big enough following that he could try and take the city of Jerusalem by force, becoming the Messiah, or Anointed One, that would then rule Judea independently of the Romans. But he failed, and somehow escaped crucifixion, although there was perhaps some doubt over whether or not he was in fact killed, which might explain the resurrection appearances, as well as the Barabbas story, the one in which Barabbas is set free and Jesus is crucified. It's long been noted that the name Barabbas literally means son of the Father, meaning that Jesus and Barabbas might actually have been the same person, and that the original source material simply chose to give us 2 possible endings to the story, kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure book. Finally, over time, it's possible that the idea of Jesus, aka the Egyptian, being a physical Messiah, morphed into the idea that he was instead more of a spiritual Messiah, particularly after 70 CE when Jerusalem was destroyed and all hope of a physical victory was lost. That's when his comment on the Mount of Olives about the walls coming down went from being something he had planned to do at that very moment to a prophecy he made about the future. Interestingly, it was around 70 CE that the earliest Gospels were written. Perhaps it was at that point that the writers decided to shift the events to an earlier, more peaceful time, so that the focus could be more on Jesus' spiritual teachings rather than on his insurrection. All they had to do was switch Felix to Pontius Pilate and work in a mention of Emperor Tiberius, a change that was then copied by future historians such as Tacitus. So that's hypothesis number 2. Once again, let me know in the comments what you think. Feel free to give it a ranking from 0 if you think it's complete BS to 10 if you think it's definitely true. Next time, we'll go back to the man I mentioned in connection to the rebellion of 6 CE, Judas of Galilee, because according to this book, it is Jesus and Judas who are the same person. Until then, thanks for watching.